Welcome to Architects for Change, the podcast that bridges the gap between architecture, the built environment and politics. I'm Jay Morton, your host. I'm an architect and political geek, and together we'll hear from the change makers and thought leaders who are shaping the future of our cities and spaces. Our conversations will tackle pressing questions that hold the key to our future. How can we achieve a net zero future? What does it truly take to design a better world? And most importantly, how can politics play a pivotal role in breaking down the barriers that hinder progress? Okay, welcome Dinah Bornat, who is the director of ZCD Architects, but also the author of All to Play For, How to Design Child-Friendly Housing, which was released a few weeks ago, I believe, under the RIBA publishing. So welcome. I think it's really exciting to talk to you because you've been talking about placemaking and obviously child-friendly housing, which is a real prominent feature, and it's actually featured in some of the other podcasts that I've done as well. But rather than me talking about you, maybe you can give me a brief intro about yourself, but also sort of what led you to focus on child-friendly design.
Brilliant. Thanks for having me, Jay. Lovely introduction. So yeah, I'm the director at ZCD Architects. We're based in East London. We've been going for over 10 years. What led me into this, I think, was a desire to shift the work of the practice more into housing and to use research and evidence as a kind of basis for that. And just became really interested in this idea of child-friendly cities because there's some of it about, and watching play streets in my local area. We had one, and thinking this is a really important urban design planning phenomenon, and we need to be kind of connecting that kind of use of space back to how we think as architects and designers.
So it's about the sort of spaces in between the buildings, not just the buildings themselves, and how many communities can come together.
Yeah. So for me, there was a bit of a kind of, I suppose, light bulb moment when we set up a play street in Hackney, and the beginning of the sort of London doing play streets coming from the playing out movement in Bristol. And that idea that kids haven't been playing out as much as when we were younger, and that if you close the street to traffic, suddenly you recreate the childhoods that we've all kind of lost. So yeah, it's very much about that space just outside your front door and how kind of vital that is in housing and residential design.
I suppose, and it's that free play, isn't it? It's in exploring your neighbourhood, less of the helicopter parenting, just letting people go and just explore the space and each other. So, I mean, obviously that's not happening everywhere. And I think that there has been a topic of conversations over quite a few of the interviews I've done so far, is that we have a bit of an issue with the state of our towns and cities. Where would you think we are going wrong?
So I think I was thinking about this when in the lead up to this podcast, and I think that maybe if we all sort of jump back the last sort of 30 years, this has been coming for a long time. We know there's a problem, and we've known about the problem for an awful long time. I remember when the Barker report came out, which was written by Kate Barker under the last Labour government, I think towards the tail end, which highlighted the housing supply issue, highlighted the lack of house building going on from the private sector following the changes in the sort of late 70s, early 80s under Thatcher. And it was a problem then, and it doesn't feel like we've been able to do anything about it. We've been very focused on housing as an asset, being on the housing ladder, watching property values rise, which has really, really benefited some people. But anyone could have seen where it was going, and it's gone exactly where we said it was going to go. And I think it's probably worse than we imagined, but we need to do something about it now. And if we'd started 20 years ago, we could be in a better position, but we've got a lot to do now, I think.
I mean, in terms of reimagining what our cities can be?
I think maybe if you think about sort of like big stages, we had our towns and cities white paper, which was sort of great to have an architect, Richard Rogers, sort of at the forefront of rethinking what our cities could be like in a kind of European style. And then we had that important report. And then in the interim period, in the intervening period, you've got people like David Cameron talking about sort of rebuilding our sink estates. But actually, that was more to do, I think, with quite a political move and an opportunity, if you like, to kind of make money out of regeneration, which I think for a lot of communities there's a huge and rightful amount of cynicism about that, because it's, you know, gentrification has become a kind of a word now even used by GCSE pupils in their geography lessons, and it's become part of the fabric of our cities. Is the change that we've gone through isn't the right change.
So you're saying it's that we're looking at land and property, we're looking at them as sort of assets and money, but we've actually forgotten about the placemaking and the spaces between. Because actually you mentioned in your book about the sink estates, and actually what was sort of missed in that whole Cameron conversation was that there were families there, and actually there were spaces that people occupied and actually enjoyed as well. There were bad things happening, but that was more because of neglect. But actually there was also good things about those estates as well. Maybe elaborate a little bit more.
Yeah, because that's essentially where we started with our research, was this idea that children playing out had completely disappeared. And living in Hackney, which is a borough that's held on to a lot of its housing, I could tell walking through the estates that actually that wasn't entirely the case, because the kind of streets-based urbanism that many politicians of the time, and probably still, certainly would have lived on, would have led them to believe that that was the way for everybody. But in fact, you're right, that there was a deliberate move in those years of the 1980s and 90s to completely discredit the post-war housing boom. And in a sense, the architecture profession kind of went with it, and that it was this kind of social experiment gone wrong. But actually, if you look at many, many, many housing estates and you talk to people who grew up on them, it turns out that actually they had great childhoods. And I think what's interesting about that, not to sort of like be fetishistic about it, but is that spatially there was something going on that worked. And that those of us who grew up mainly on streets, although I did for part of my childhood live on a cul-de-sac, which was brilliant playing out, we lost that space and that freedom. But the estates didn't, because the streets were deliberately planned not to kind of plough through them and to give children places to play.
So cars were kept outside.
Yeah. So this thinking goes right back. And I think what's really important is that in this deliberate throwing the baby out with the bathwater and more, and discrediting a kind of a history of housing design and thought and research, with it when all of the kind of social glue and the understanding of what was working and what wasn't working. And you're right. So again, I'm not trying to see everything through rose-tinted glasses, but I think that at the heart of it is this difference between the kind of UK's car-centric model, which is perhaps a kind of bad version of the sort of suburban garden cities. And a kind of, with a bit of Radburn and a bit of cul-de-sacs and some sort of, that sort of become
the kind of quintessential street. It's like little front garden with the car parks outside on the street, and then everyone has a private back garden.
That's
and
right.
Nobody occupies the front of the house.
Yeah.
Which is a shame, actually.
Yeah. And actually that's a really oversimplified kind of typology. Yeah. But it is the typology.
Yeah.
If you see what I mean.
Yeah.
So it's like you could probably find some nice versions of that in Hampstead Garden suburbs or in like some of the new towns, or maybe just in some modern versions, and say, look, it's quite nice and the front garden's quite a social space. But essentially what you just described is what the house builders are selling. Without any evocation of social space, knowing your neighbours. And I think that's a shame, because I don't think it's necessarily naturally.
I suppose it goes to thinking about what habitat is And actually, and I think is it Tim Gill who said that if you've got if children, they're sort of what's the word?
The indicator
species, that if they're thriving, if you can see them
yeah,
outside of the home and in public space, then that space is doing well, then everyone can thrive.
Yeah.
Whereas if you're not seeing that, then it's actually not a good habitat.
Yeah, and we found that. So when we started doing our research, what was really interesting was we were doing people counting, basically, standing in open spaces, in housing estates, and just watching and counting who was in that space, how long they were there, guessing their ages. And what was really interesting was we saw that spaces that were occupied by children playing outside independently, without adults, were spaces that adults were using as well.
Right.
So this idea that they're the indicator species is really, really true.
Yeah, yeah.
And so it doesn't always have to be that children are outside independently, but it's a sense of a space that's got safe enough for children.
Yeah, and it doesn't feel threatening, because I suppose that's the thing. Like the city can be quite a stressful, hostile environment, and if you're happy to allow your children to just walk a bit further away from you, it's better for you in terms of your feeling and mental health. So it obviously means that the space is working and it's making you feel relaxed and you're enjoying it, rather than constantly feeling. I mean, I know for me, the school run is my son has a bike and he's on a hill, and to get home it's going downhill. And I try to be brave, and I've got my bicycle and I'm on the road and he's on the pavement, but I will cycle ahead to block the road, because there's so many people driving 4x4s, which I think a 4x4, there is no place for that anywhere near a school, but they're everywhere and they drive really fast, and particularly in the winter when it's dark. And I'm constantly it's only going to take one moment of him getting distracted and that's it, which you shouldn't have to feel like that in the city.
That's right. I mean, you say
every day, it's twice a day you're doing that school, and twice a day you're feeling on edge.
Yeah. I think that's really important. I think because if you focus on the kind of car-centric development, essentially the risk level, the risk is death or serious injury.
Yeah.
To be frank.
It goes back to it being a hostile environment. Yeah.
And even if that risk is, half of 1% every day, that's a risk that's not worth taking.
Yeah. Yeah.
I mean, if the risk was breaking your arm.
Yeah, fine. Which is like climbing frame risk.
You're and that's the kind of level of risk that that, because that's not great having a broken bone.
Yeah.
But it's it's more than survivable, and it's not life-changing. And just to sort of, if you were ever to sit and think about it, and I think that those two risks are very different, aren't they? So children being able to play out freely, and they might break their arm or more likely fall over and cut their leg, or maybe get lost. All of those are the sorts of risks I think probably most of us would quite like children to take, because they're kind of good parts of life that we all did as children, and we remember doing
it's that. Learning. I mean, isn't there I read somewhere about the sort of move to the car-centric cities, where we actually started to get more of the gated play parks. What's your view on gated play parks in cities?
Yeah, when I talk about playgrounds, and I always remind people or let them know that I absolutely am not a playground expert at all. I can't even tell anyone how to design a playground.
Yeah.
But I always say that it's totally reasonable to put a fence around any area that children might be playing if there's a risk of them being run over.
Yeah. But I suppose, is that the thing, that we should have cities where they don't necessarily need...
Oh, that would be the best, wouldn't it?
Yeah.
I mean, even bicycles and small children are not a great mix. But I think that often when we're talking about gating and securing developments, which is not common in London, but is quite common outside London, which I think is really interesting. We're talking about all sorts of different kinds of security. This is the sort of conversation that we have as architects, isn't it? It's like, are we going to make that 2 meters high with a fob, or are we going to make it a gate that anybody over the age of 10 can easily open and come and go, but it stops a small child running out?
Yeah.
And those are two very different kind of boundaries, aren't they? Or are we going to make it a kind of notional boundary where we're safe with the children, they're not going to get run over, and we're just kind of suggesting that people shouldn't be wandering in and out? And I think you know, we've gone into quite a niche thing, but I think talking about boundaries and talking about cars and talking about edges and talking about how those shared spaces in developments, if we have them kind of fit together with the wider neighbourhood, is really, really important, I think.
And I suppose we're almost talking about these things, two different ways of designing towns and cities and spaces and housing. But actually, it's not just about this. We're not just saying there's two different spatial ways of doing it. Actually, the reason for talking about it is because of the link between health and well-being. And I mean, you've said yourself that housing has always been linked to public health, and I think we seem to be forgetting that. Why do you think we keep forgetting that?
Because if, as we've been doing for the last couple of generations now, I guess, which is to sort of see housing in the market terms and as an asset and as an opportunity to kind of accrue wealth and security in old age, then where we've got to now with it being unaffordable to nearly everybody means that we've got a broken market, but that market was never meeting the needs of people in terms of their health needs of here and now. It was about all of those other things, wasn't it?
Yeah.
And now it only seems to be serving the house builders as a sort of model for generating their profit. I don't think we're thinking hard enough about what the kind of rental future might look like. We're so terrified of admitting that the housing ladder isn't a concept we can even use as a description of your life now in the southeast. We had a problem 20 years ago with housing in the southeast in terms of affordability and supply, and now we've got a problem that is kind of so deep rooted because people can't afford to stay in London, people can't afford to teach your children. Nurses and even doctors can't afford to kind of look after us and stay in the centre of our capital city. So housing's become a problem for everybody, even the rich. And I'm surprised, actually, I think, that this government isn't taking a more kind of active review of it.
And we're in a situation now where there's probably a large proportion of MPs who are still renting, still living with parents, actually, as well. That's only going to get more and more and more, and then maybe they will start to pay a bit more attention. But I guess and then the other side is that then you've got a whole load of voters who don't want to see their house prices reduce, and then there's the other element of, I mean, there's a lot of talk about cars, and any kind of conversation about changing the amount of cars in cities also becomes a massive political football, like LTNs, all of these things, congestion charging. It's I suppose it's quite a challenge, and I think maybe we do just need to we need a government to just be braver and maybe make more of that link, because I suppose you would say as well that we're not making enough of a link between our housing and our towns and cities and car use and health.
No, we're not. And I think when concepts like the 15-minute cities become politically charged and motivated, it's undermining kind of everything that we're trying to do and any kind of way forward that we can see. Because quite often, I think we'll find ourselves as architects on housing developments having to make the case for parking numbers and layouts that are kind of reducing car use or, servicing or whatever. Whereas actually we should be getting on with designing really great places, and those kind of that brief should be set and not a kind of political hot potato that we are kind of having to sort of hold through planning. So I think if you think about countries outside the UK where maybe child friendliness works more smoothly, places like the Northern European countries, where they've really kind of pushed for cycling, mobility, and what we would call sustainable transport, have basically benefited children because the cars are less prevalent in the public space. I mean, even in Holland, which has apparently got the highest level of car ownership in Europe.
Yeah, it is actually quite surprising, I think.
But they don't use the car, as I understand it, so much during the week. It's a kind of weekend thing, but it's used to kind of getting out into the countryside. Whereas in the cities,
They're not
during the
doing
week.
their short journeys. Yeah.
Yeah, so that has a massive impact. So the cars are sitting around, but they're not like right outside the front door, and they're not kind of invading that space that we need to be using. And then in the southern European countries, you've got much more kind of strong culture of the family and families being outside and being in space. So a different culture, like the independence of the northern European countries, of children, you know, getting out there and getting on their bikes, and then the kind of family culture of the southern European. And then we're sort of like, we're somewhere else. I wouldn't say we're in the middle. We're somewhere else where we have this kind of Englishness or Britishness, if you like, which I don't know whether it is sort of like embodied by the suburban model.
Yeah.
All of those countries have got sort of suburban and rural models as well.
But it's sort of closed off. I mean, I think this was the interesting thing about in the lockdown, that all of a sudden people on my street were sitting on their front doorsteps. And it was really nice. You'd walk and see people and wave, and that everyone's gone back to hiding behind their front doors, which is a bit of a shame.
It is,
because how that sort of activated the street. And then you could imagine that if there were more people just sitting out in their front street, if you did sort of close, you would be happy for children, even if it wasn't you keeping an eye. There's somebody else was sort of there.
Yeah. It's a real shame, isn't it? Because I always think that within our cultures there are some kind of some moments or some kind of qualities that we should kind of hold on to. And I think the English front garden, the fact that you could be out there tending it and chatting to neighbours, or maybe sitting on a bench, somehow in housing has become the phrase, the privacy strip, which just makes me feel so
defensive of space.
Yes.
Yeah.
And
very, very, very hostile.
It is
hostile language.
Very hostile.
Rather than it being the communal, or what's another word you could have for it? The sort of,
well, I mean, the front garden. Yeah, the front garden where you might have pride in your roses, which would be, you know, I think most people in Britain would find quite, you know.
I mean, that was all the graphic. If you look up the Becontree Estate and you look at all the graphics, it is all about everyone tending to their front gardens, because it was actually part of the condition of living there that you had to look after your front garden.
Yeah,
I think.
I mean, it's a little bit stiff, isn't it?
Yeah.
God forbid you might hang your washing out there.
Yeah.
And we need to maybe relax a little bit, but it's something that is a nice idea, isn't it? And actually, when I was walking through Hampstead Garden suburbs recently, kind of like having a bit of a look around, you know, what's great about it? Beautiful vistas and you know, the picturesque. This woman appeared suddenly, and turns out she'd grown up in the suburbs and talked about what it was like as a child there and how she played out all the time. And one of the things she said that I thought was really revealing was, she said, well, of course the hedges were really low.
Right.
And as we walked around, the hedges are 2.5 meters high. They're really big. They're proper big barriers. And she said that was the rule. You couldn't grow your hedge over, I don't know, let's say it was 1100 or something. And that's interesting, isn't it? Because that's a deliberate social move.
Yes. And that, and see the lights on, you can see the street.
You can see your kids playing out. And there have been less cars. And so for her, she had the freedom in the suburban model.
Yeah.
Despite the fact that it is all quite kind of, you know, retreats from the street a bit. And made of the front gardens, and they certainly, some of them still are, were quite kind of delightful, had opportunities to sit outside. And yet somehow that has got lost, and everyone's hidden now behind these hedges. And something as small as that, back to the boundaries again. What's the boundary between private and shared or public space? Makes a huge difference.
So it's like opening up to the community rather than closing yourself away from the community. Like open rather than defensible. Which I suppose, and these are all kind of tiny moves that you don't need to completely rip up everything and start again. It's actually just small moves that we can all make to start to sort of make our cities a bit more open and engaging, I guess.
And actually the fact that you just used the word defensible, and Alice Coleman and others, Oscar Newman, were talking, I think, about defensible, and defensible being different to defensive. Because defensible means you can defend and you're after that space, which is what they were advocating for. Because they were concerned that, you know, much criticism about the way that research developed into sort of secure by design theories, but they were concerned that there was all this kind of space that no one was looking after or kind of had any ownership over. And there's lots of talk, isn't there, when we do our designs around courtyards and stuff about who's going to own the space, who's going to love it, who's going to look after it. And I think the challenge in really, really high density cities that we are designing is that suddenly the doorstep space that I'm talking about actually needs to be used by a lot of people.
Yeah.
And I think that's where people start to kind of have problems with children playing outside or making noises or, so that the childhood becomes kind of harder in those environments.
Do we think, because obviously historically with the no ball games started to appear, and it started to feel that in a lot of spaces within estates that children weren't welcome. Also, you have a lot of people complaining about noise coming from schools. Do you think as a society we're starting to, we've gone the wrong way in terms of hearing, seeing children and hearing play, and maybe we need to kind of move back again? I don't know.
I honestly think that's always been a problem.
Right. Okay.
So those from what I've read,
yeah,
our attitude towards childhood. I mean, if you think about the Victorian child, I mean...
Oh, yeah, we didn't treat them very well.
No. Yeah. I mean, all the pictures of children playing out, poor children playing out, that's certainly not how middle-class children were expected to behave.
Yeah, be seen, not heard.
Yeah. That kind of behaviour, that kind of sort of loose, risky stuff, that was not how middle-class children were expected to behave. I mean, for lots of reasons, I'm kind of guessing here. We didn't have any antibiotics, you had to be careful.
Yes, yeah.
But I mean, even just falling over, there was a much higher level of mortality, a much higher level of risk. You were looking after your genes very carefully. I mean, you still are with the car.
Yeah, true. Yeah,
but there were other risks that were life-threatening, I think. But I think there's a kind of benign neglect that we all remember from our childhoods, and I think actually probably, funnily enough, all children probably do, because they're the ones that are trying to take risks. So your son is kind of predisposed evolutionarily to ride fast down a hill, and you're predisposed to shove off. That's always the way. And so you kind of recognise that. There's a point, isn't there, where like, you've got to weigh up the two.
Yeah, and we've got to sort of let go. It's a push pull.
Yeah.
And going back to, so you've mentioned examples abroad. So I think what can we learn from some of those examples? And actually, have you got anything that's any examples from your research that you would think are sort of a prime example of what's working?
Yeah, I think in my travels, looking at housing estates or housing developments, it's quite fun actually when you go to a city to sort of arrive and decide that you're not going to visit any art galleries.
You look at places and streets.
Yeah, you're going to get out of the city centre and wander around residential developments.
Yeah.
It's quite fun. And actually there's some really nice examples in Holland and Denmark where you can really see the way people occupy that space between the house or the block of flats in the street, where they might go out and have their dinner. Quite interesting kind of sort of split level arrangements going on in some of those housing developments that I think we would probably not be able to do here because our regulations around wheelchair accessibility are actually a lot stronger. So sometimes what some of us might see as quite delightful is challenging. Yeah. So we have to try and be able to do it all, don't we, with what we have available. So those are really nice examples, I think, of traditional blocks, relationships with the shared garden out the back, and perhaps sometimes they are closed off. And then in Holland, where you've got quite a lot of good examples of different looking at essentially developments where the bike is there. And the bike is much more, I think, of a sort of everyday thing. So they seem less concerned with having them locked away. Yeah. And that does feel easier in some ways, because you're not kind of having to provide internal bike space across a quarter of your ground floor. And it comes back to this, doesn't it? Because as a kind of jigsaw puzzle conundrum that we have to do as architects, we know that the car is this kind of thing that we're
Yeah.
trying to sort of fit in, and we're trying to make it less important than the social use of space and people's opportunity to meet each, you know, in kind of informal and formal ways, and for children to play, I hope. And then somehow when we get to in front of our communities, which I think is really interesting, the work that we do, it becomes the most important.
Oh yeah, every public consultation, it's parking.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And I'm really interested in how we kind of shift that conversation.
Yeah.
And we shift that conversation so that by the time we get to talking about parking, we've built up so much positive.
Yeah. This is what the alternative could be.
Yeah.
How good it could be.
But also it comes from personal experience.
Yeah.
So what I try and do when I'm talking to communities is to get them to kind of think back to their own childhoods and the freedom that they had as children.
That's a good way of framing it. Yeah.
And recognise what that was spatially. Get them to show us where they live, or even where they lived before, because the power of Google Street View is really helpful. And to show them that the spatial elements were essentially what you're going to be doing in the new development.
And actually maybe where they lived before when they were a kid, that what's happened since, they wouldn't be able to have played and lived their existence in the same way, because it probably is full of 4x4s.
Possibly, yeah. Well, what's really interesting is talking to residents in all sorts of different places, and there's always somewhere in the local area where the children still do play out, or the children will tell you that as well. And the other thing that we do is to make sure that those community groups have children in them. So that you're not talking about them as another group, so that they can actually say, well, actually, we do play out. And their community can hear that firsthand. I think that's really important. That's something quite new to us. Often it would be like young people and residents would be engaged separately. But when they start to show you where the children still play out, you can say, oh, you know why that is, don't you?
Yeah. Okay.
It's because this is the spatial situation. The cars are over there, or they're stationary because it's a cul-de-sac. And it's always the same every single time. And so you can say, look, we're just recreating a larger scale version of what you've told us works. So we're using your knowledge to kind of sort of give you a kind of future neighbourhood that's built on your evidence, rather than let's show you something we've done miles away from where you live, but we think it's really nice. As architects, that's, you've already removed yourself from that lived experience, haven't you?
It's about engaging, finding the points that people like and enjoy and treasure in their local community. So then when they can, I mean, I think I actually said this in an interview that I did, or about actually how then they're engaging with talking about architecture and space, and they realize they can do that because they're talking about their local environment, rather than, like you say, talking about a development that's completely alien to them.
So then you get to the car and you say, but you really want this. We're gonna have to kind of
something has to give. And I suppose this leads on to, so that's almost sort of the recipe that you've sort of described there of what us as designers should be doing, and you know, and I suppose why it's important. I suppose the next, we've talked about communities, but I guess the next layer is governments themselves. Obviously, there's the drive to build 1.5 million homes. Do you think that they sort of understand the need for child-friendly housing? Is this even part of the conversation yet?
I've not seen any evidence that they've made the link. So I think that the recent walk around the development in Dorset with the King, where we were all as a profession horrified by the amount of tarmac.
Well,
And
and
I think, you know, it's really easy for us architects who are working in housing to see that immediately. There's a problem here. And we have to be cleverer at making that development or subsequent developments not completely dominated by the car. And all those delightful moments we just talked about won't happen or physically exist.
I suppose this is the thing, it's about the education of like what alternatives can be. Like you say, you've got a lot of the major house builders building a lot of homes in creating suburbs that are very car dominated, and it is that sort of quintessential default house type with the front garden and the tarmac and the street. And do you think because that's so ubiquitous, this is what anyone who doesn't really look beyond that, that's what they think a home is?
Yeah, I think that's become the only kind of way that we think about the housing market. I don't really know, but like I go around the UK on a train a lot. I haven't got a car anymore.
Oh wow, well done.
Well, my kids are older, so that makes it easier. But yeah, don't have a car, go on a train a lot, and just see a lot of. I'm probably would say from the rows, just the kind of boxes in the in the driveways and stuff, and I just think that's it. That's all we're doing. That's literally. It's everywhere. There's nothing else. So I'm assuming that that's what this government is expecting more of.
Yeah.
Because they haven't seen much else, or kind of are showcasing or have a vision for something else that we could all get excited about.
Yeah.
And I'm worried. No, I'm not worried, but I can't see any evidence that they haven't kind of let go of the negativity around essentially that kind of mass housing, which we don't call anymore mass housing, period after the war, where the ideas of health and the ideas of children being able to play outside and the ideas of community were kind of interwoven with architecture and landscape and a kind of and the policy and the guidance around it. I can't see that vision.
Because actually, I suppose in the book you mentioned this as well, don't you, that every kind of major house building program, it was often as a result of health, a public health issue. So you mentioned the state of soldiers in the First World War. We realised it was because of poor housing, and then also in the mid-century, where again the state of poor housing, more slum clearance. All these new bold house building programs were actually a public health response.
Yeah.
Which now it's it's more about numbers, but actually it is the same thing. We've got children who are living in overcrowding, which is obviously really bad for their health. It's bad for everyone's mental health to not have a stable home. But we're not kind of talking about the link between the two maybe enough at the moment, and then what those spaces could be.
Yeah, and I think that if we go down this route where we're going to speed up the planning system, which I'm a bit worried about, but also there's a lot of truth in that. We all of us could be doing this a bit faster and not having to produce such enormous amounts of documentation to get things through planning. I agree with that. But yeah, if you think about Nye Bevan after the war, he was responsible for health and housing together.
Yeah,
and that's never been the case since.
Maybe we need to go back to that.
Yeah, I mean, there's certainly, having had various meetings with civil servants, I should say, in central government at MHCLG and the Department of Education, and saying, you could do really well to talk to each other. Because what's really useful about children is that they cut across particularly those two departments. They can also then start to bring in transport and environment and actually those conversations, we know this because as architects, as the lead consultant, we would have to be understanding all of these disciplines and kind of drawing them all together. And I think, that skill and that interest we have, that's nurtured in us should be when we're at university, is why we're so keen to be involved in really kind of strategic and detailed thinking. And that's why architecture is such an amazing profession to be part of, because you're making links to human beings and their lives and their lived experience. You're making links to kind of technology, and it's a really, really broad, brilliant profession.
It's sort of, I always go back to I always say four-dimensional thinking. I think it's like five-dimensional thinking. It's even more than that. It's the web of how all those things connect, as opposed to maybe the more 0 and 1 thinkers, where like the complete opposite to that.
A friend asked me, which I'm sure you've had this question asked to you before, like, do you think grand designs has been helpful to the profession?
You have asked that. Yeah, what would your answer be?
Well, I think what it's done is it's made people think that that's what we do.
That's what we
We do love houses.
Yeah, we're just sort of doing posh houses for rich people.
Yeah.
Actually, we can bring a lot to the table talking about space,
Yeah.
general,
Yeah.
across the board, the streets, housing, mass housing, individual housing, across the board.
Yeah. Yeah, and so maybe because I'm a woman, I often, you're out at a party and someone asks you what you do, and you say you're an architect, and they say, "Oh, back extensions," and you're like, "No, not back extensions,
No, big things."
Yeah, but I think actually the reason I was asked that question was partly because they were suggesting that maybe grand designs had a negative impact on us,
Right.
because the narrative on grand designs is that the architect is fairly insignificant, and the narrative arc is about that person's personal journey, and the fact that they know what they want, the owner, what we would call the client.
Yeah, and maybe this goes to actually what we were talking about earlier, that obviously there's what should government be doing, but actually maybe it is the question of what us as an industry should be doing to show those who are making the decisions in government what we can bring to the table and how we can collaborate and work together. What do you think that should look like?
Well, I mean, absolutely. And I think obviously we could come to the table with a lot of like psychological baggage, let's just say, like we've had enough of like, depressing fees and, a profession that's now really expensive to enter and to like maintain as a career, and the lack of diversity. So all of those and procurement models that are just kind of slowly killing us all. And that's true because it's part of the same problem.
Yeah.
But like in terms of us being the solution, I think that what we obviously got to get better at doing is thinking like the politicians. It would be good if they could think a bit like us, because we have really good knowledge of, we should have the whole overview of the system. I think we should get much better at understanding how investment works, how the development industry works, the whole thing, so that we can make a link at that first point where people are thinking about buying land and being strategic. But we've got all those skills, and I think we can also, especially when it comes to housing, my book's a good example of this, we can also do a lot of our own research. We present it. Yeah, we can look at it and we can provide evidence and say that we know this, like we know their children are playing out, for example, and we can make big links back to health. But we do need a seat at the table. And we need to be seen as experts, and we need to be seen as people who can help get those 1.5 million homes built without slowing it down by
without costing more money.
With more policy and more guidance. Perhaps I sound like I'm going in the wrong direction, but we would all like to be putting more money into the housing itself, wouldn't we? So that the quality of the materials was better, the detailing was better. We'd all want to be doing that, because we can see the delight and the benefits in thinking and not just doing boxes. So somehow we've got to show them that there's more efficiency, which is what's in the book. Like, look at what the house builders are doing. It's inefficient.
And also, I suppose there's decisions that you can make that doesn't make much difference in terms of cost, but like the layout of a street that can make a difference as to whether children can play out or not. And that's it. Probably, but both versions will cost probably the same, but one will have a better impact on health. And I suppose we need that link to be made, that the better way of thinking about things.
And we're wasting a lot of time getting to a point where the highways or engineer in the borough says nope.
Oh, this is the thing, this has come up a lot, highways engineers. So it's like, what, where are they? Why aren't they in the conversation? Why isn't their remit to kind of make places that are as child friendly? And I think the reason that I got kind of really interested in the child side of it is because they use space really differently. So pedestrians, I think, you're picturing a kind of able-bodied Yes.
walking person, which is wrong in and of itself.
Yeah. Yeah.
But that kind of economically active person leaving a home on their way to work and coming home.
Mm-hmm.
But they don't represent all people.
No. Yeah. Yeah.
And actually, I think what's interesting is that the child is the person that's spending 85% of their waking hours in their local neighbourhood, not a school. That's a huge amount of time. The pedestrian working adult is probably spending half, if not less than half of that time, especially if they're not got any caring responsibilities. So actually, you've really got a whole group of people, 25% of the population, plus people who are like out of work for whatever reason, who be in around their neighbourhood, really needing the support of their neighbours, really needing their friends to play with, whose needs aren't being met because the pedestrian, the walking person,
who's not even paying attention to this, because obviously the other thing is the way a child walks down the street, which can be really frustrating.
Yeah.
They're like looking at everything, picking things up, like asking questions and picking at leaves and all of these things, and actually engaging with their environment probably much more intimately. And I guess it also, the other thing is the elderly. And I actually, one podcast that I did quite a few episodes ago was Gil Penalosa, who's done the 8 and 80 cities. So it's also that other demographic who are probably or more likely to be in their neighbourhood, and actually people being out and about, and or being able to just walk outside your house and maybe speak to somebody. Which like my nan lives in a village which has now used to have 4 shops, has no shops, so now she spends all of her time inside. But actually, maybe if the street was a bit more active, she probably would sit outside and maybe talk to people.
Yeah.
So I suppose that's the other way of thinking about it.
Yeah.
Isn't it? Yeah.
I mean, from a personal perspective, I hope my parents don't mind me saying this, they've just moved from a house on a street in London to the Olympic Park.
Oh, right. Wow. That's great.
Yeah. So they've recognised at 80, they've recognised that like it's going to be hard to live in a house, a big house.
Yeah.
I have been there several times, obviously, and they're always, when we're out and about, they've been chatting to their neighbours in the corridor, in the lift, in the lobby, in ways that I didn't even see quite so much in that street. So that's just my mini observation. But
and also it's very walkable.
It's very walkable.
Yeah.
So not only are they meeting their neighbours and their small children, and they are kind of much older than most of the residents because it hasn't deliberately focused on their group, I think, to try and move them in. But, you know, there's a lot of people that need to downsize or resize. And there's benches everywhere. There's walks they can go on. There's shops, although they'd love a few more.
Yeah.
But, like, they don't have to go far to access all sorts of things. Plus, you know, there's all the culture, everything.
ABBA.
Yeah. All of that is just there. And so, like, there's also sort of generosity in the spaces. So that I kind of sold it to them when I walked them around on a nice summer's afternoon. Yeah. I said, look, what's lovely is there's lots of cafes, but there's also this kind of extra stretch of public realm where there's benches, and it's really obvious that you can sit and be part of the cafe culture without having to buy anything.
Yeah, yeah.
So I think the 880 cities is really, really real. And I mean, I don't think that just because it is designed for children, it works for older people. But I do think you can start to look at so many crossovers and commonalities. So.
And it's those safer spaces, slower spaces, less cars, more spaces where you can hang out without spending money is the other really important thing in terms of communities, because, and I guess democracy in space, because you can have people who are wealthy and people who aren't wealthy all hanging out in the same space.
Yeah, and I think we really have to think about this when we're architects, don't we? Because I think sometimes you can see suburbia, you can see it in film, as being kind of controlling women, in the kind of family model,
keeping them at home.
It's very heteronormative. It's very singular. It's very car dominated. So it makes the car industry, the oil industry, a lot of money. And the whole thing is almost deliberately antisocial. And so for women and for people who might have a disability, who find that environment difficult, the lack of support, the level of isolation, recognizing things like postnatal depression as being really prevalent and something that is really common. How can going home and being trapped whilst your husband drives to their job be the way that we really want to live? And yet somehow we've been kind of sold that is the embodiment of the family and the kind of what underpins us as a nation. And I don't think that's true, but I think that that there are some politics behind this. I don't think the house builders are deliberately popping that up, but I think that is what is being sold that people want.
Yeah, I suppose this goes back to, I mean, it's the same thing as why in the supermarket all the apples look a certain way because they think that's what everybody wants, when actually probably wouldn't mind the wobbly bumpy ones. Sounds fine. It is something slightly, it's because they keep giving us that's what we think what a home should be and what space should be. And I guess this goes back to what we were saying just now, that actually I guess it's up to us to try and show the benefits of an alternative way of doing things. And I guess this needs to feed back to government, because we've got this big ambition. It is quite an opportunity. So I guess maybe this is sort of maybe backing up on one of the last questions is, I mean, what are the sort of key policies that, if we are going to deliver these homes, what are the key things that you'd like to see government think about?
I think the easiest thing to do in terms of a mindset shift is to stop seeing the house builder profit market model as the way to provide the housing that we all need, and to recognize it as something that doesn't work. And so we are not going to be able to go from all these providers of homes not existing overnight, but there could be a really clear kind of vision that says, or is underpinned by a recognition that the profit from building homes is not the motivation behind what we're doing, that we need to be making communities that will need some government investment, that will need investment in affordable housing upfront and promises, so that private investment can come in. But also private investment we're seeing from lots of funds is really focusing on social impact, because they can see sort of long-term benefits in that. So there are loads of alternative models, but I think that at the moment, because of the procurement process, in terms of the sale of land or development, developers coming in and you know, buying and building on publicly owned land, the kind of cost model is driving everything, which goes straight back to the developer's profit. So that the whole kind of system is kind of geared towards that, and not really recognizing that, like, you know, if we're building rental homes, then we're going to be saving money quite quickly.
And accommodation.
Yeah, we're going to be saving. Yeah, exactly. We're going to be saving in all sorts of areas, and actually we need to hold on to it. So, like, to sort of create a vision that does really start to say that the state needs to have more kind of ownership and investment and control in all sorts of ways around what housing is and how it can deliver great places. And we should be really positive about that.
Yeah.
Because I think that you know, I think that the house builder model is a good profit-driven model for the volume house builders. And I know, and you and I know, that it's not easy to build a house.
No.
It's got loads of levels of risk.
Yeah.
And if you've got a model that's really simple,
and the profit margins are tight.
Yeah.
And that's why the volume holders work.
Exactly. And they've got supply chain, localized supply chain models, and it works really well for them. And you've got to get it right, because if they start leaking, and, you know, costs are ridiculous, so they need to sell the right product. So it's not totally straightforward, is it? And we've got to recognise that it takes some thinking and investment and research, and kind of, you know, I suppose how you might look at drug development or something, or long-term way. I don't know if it's the same, but like, until we dismantle the kind of the kind of model, if you like, at the moment, which is that we're going to allow companies whose consideration isn't long term.
Yeah.
We're not going to get anywhere. It's going to stay the same, isn't it? So
yeah, and I suppose this is the thing that the like government and local authorities, they have the long-term vision in terms of society and placemaking, and maybe there needs, I guess, be more that understanding of would you say, the value of the other bits, the stuff that you're talking about actually needs to have a value to it.
Yeah, and the planning system, I suppose, needs to support that vision. And I think that we would probably all agree, and maybe there's ways that we could look at other models in other countries. There were some really good things going on in the UK. I think we've got really good community engagement record, and probably the reason for that is because developments are responsible for master planning rather than local municipalities. So they become political, and planning committees are politically motivated. And so we kind of, we do good community engagement to de-risk planning. Children are not part of that, which is why so they never will be, because they don't own the home and vote the planning system. So they're kind of left out of this. So it's kind of worked quite well for locally motivated politics, but we all know how kind of limiting that is, and how we can't sort of realize visions. So I think we have to really think about speeding up the planning system. We have to think about bringing people along with a kind of national view, because otherwise we're just having to have these kind of, I'm not going to say fights, but all this work has to be done again and again and again locally. And I know that the government is trying to sort of like improve on sort of design codes and make it easier for local authorities to write local plans. And I know that's really important, but I think that there's this kind of a lack of vision about what good housing could look like, but also a lack of kind of understanding that we cannot leave it to the house builders.
Yeah, and that there is a direct impact in the future in terms of health and well-being, which actually is financial as well at the end of the day, isn't it? Which I guess is maybe because that's the difference between the short term and the long term.
Yeah, all of this stuff that I'm talking about has to link back to net zero. It has to link back to everything else we're trying to achieve.
And actually, that's the other one about the embodied carbon. We're always trying to reduce embodied carbon of homes, and then if you look at the sea of tarmac, which no one talks about. So actually, we have less tarmac, more green space, better for not just health and well-being, but also our water system. Everything. I guess.
So the oversimplification that falls out of the house builder model is just not working. So we need to acknowledge that.
If you had Angela Rayner here now, is that what you would say? Make sure you don't oversimplify. Or what else would you say?
I would say that the house builders are not going to be able to serve you what you need. And you need you need to take a stronger vision, and you need to see where your investment is going to make the biggest impact, and how much the private investors want to see you leading on this, and how that could be very British, very English, Scottish, Welsh, Northern Irish, and could evoke all the right bits about housing without kind of falling down the elephant traps.
So is it about, maybe reading your book as well is probably a good thing.
Read the book, and actually, we all need to work together. We all need to back to our kind of own baggage. We all need to think about how we can be more efficient, do less bidding, but just get on with it. We're all there champing at the bit, trying to build a 1.5 million house, right? And actually, they kind of need to harness that enthusiasm and energy to do it this time around, without getting stuck in that narrative that we were responsible for the failure of housing last time round, which I think we're still carrying that burden.
Okay. Do you think actually the architecture profession, there's a sort of view that we try to just be too sort of starchitecty in like the mid-century, and all the sort of sinker states that they talk about, and it's our fault?
We weren't starchitecture because we were all working
for local authorities.
We were opposite of that. But the kind of the story that we've always been told is that it was a mistake, it was an experiment gone wrong, and we know that there was some arrogance there, but there was also an awful lot of really amazing humanists.
I mean, there's some amazing estates that they've got, and in modern architecture that I mean, like Camden as an example, there was some really, really incredible developments. I think more it was the neglect of those.
And there's also some really ordinary ones where we're sitting right now here in Shoreditch and Columbia Road. The scale and the there's Lebeckin.
Yeah, it's the Lebeckin estate right here.
Lebeckin estate. There's Bell Phillips
on the as this an little addition to the Lebeckin estate. Yeah,
the scale and the kind of the sort of variety of the sort of housing over the last 150 years, I suppose, is lovely. And you just have to walk around it and sort of you can get examples of all the things that have worked. And there's tons of it. There's tons of you know, I think in lockdown we must have all walked around the streets and looked at these places that we didn't know existed and really sort of, like you say, saw people using them in different ways. And there's loads of it, and we don't well, we do as our little kind of niche thing, don't we? We talk about the places that we like, but we need to celebrate them, I think, as a country a bit more.
Yeah, and maybe so it is about also collaborating a little bit more. I suppose the industry and government need to kind of come together. Maybe we need to get better at showing what we can do.
Well, I've made the book very, very easy to read.
Well, definitely everyone should read it, obviously. And we've got one in our office. Everyone's reading it. Great. I think we'll leave it there. But thank you very much.
Thanks for having me.
Thank you. Thank you.